Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this e-seminar. My name is Arthur, and I'm really happy to be presenting to you today. So I wrote a blog post recently. You might have seen it, or Andrew might have linked to. And what I wrote in there were some lessons that I took away from the bootcamp. And so what Andrew asked me to share with you guys today is some possible strategies from these lessons that you guys may be able to apply to your own bootcamp experience, which is coming up 2 weeks from now. So I hope that some of the things that I mentioned are helpful to you, and I hope you enjoy it. So first of all, just a bit of introduction to myself. So I attended the Beyond Food Bootcamp last year in September. It's crazy how it's already been almost a year, and I really learned a lot from it. So I attended this bootcamp because it was at the intersection of startups as well as food, agriculture, and sustainability. And my own interest is in the intersection of technology and sustainability. So this was very much something that attracted me. Now, coming into this bootcamp, my background was that I had an existing startup at the time. We were building a freelancing platform where companies and nonprofits working in social impact could find remote talent through our web platform. So it was a talent sourcing platform, essentially. Now, one disclaimer I want to say is that I do come from a technical background. So I study engineering currently, and it will color some of the experiences that I had and some of the lessons I learned. So it might be good to keep that in mind. And one last thing is that I am still a student. So experientially, I probably have fewer experience than most of you. So hopefully this does give you also a sort of unique perspective into the way that I saw things at the bootcamp as well. All right, so I said a lot there already. So now I'll share my screen and let's get started. All right, great. So once again, I'll be talking about how you can prepare for your bootcamp experience. And I'll be going over some of the strategies that I thought would be useful that I could have applied to my own bootcamp, and in retrospect, what I think others can apply as well. So based on the 7 lessons from that blog post, which is also linked here on this slide, I thought of ways to turn them around and turn them into some possible suggestions and tips for you guys who are going to your bootcamp in Rio pretty soon. Now, by no means is this an exhaustive list, and it won't always match what's in the blog post, but I hope that it gives you an idea, almost like a high-level overview of some of the things that I learned at the bootcamp and what I think is useful. So let's dive in and go into the first slide. So the first strategy that I recommend to everyone is to try and cultivate discipline as an existing or a prospective entrepreneur. And you may have been doing the online courses. Well, I certainly hope you have. But essentially, the whole idea of the MIT Bootcamps is built around this idea of disciplined entrepreneurship. Now, when I first took the online course, or I heard this term disciplined entrepreneurship, I'll be honest, I was pretty skeptical. I thought it was just another buzzword that could help MIT maybe get more attendees at their bootcamps, sort of like a marketing ploy. But it wasn't until I attended the bootcamp that I realized that this idea of disciplined entrepreneurship is much more than just what they tell you in the online courses. It's much more than just that framework of 24 steps. If I were to word it a different way, I would call it a way to see entrepreneurship as something strategic. And I think many of us we probably read the news or we follow startup news. And quite often we see news coming from Silicon Valley, and we see how there's these 15-year-olds who started some new company, and they're hackers who are cobbling together some solution to save the world. Now, these people are definitely very skilled and very ambitious, but we have to remember that there's so many nuances and complexities in building a business that you don't see until you get actually involved in the process. So what MIT really does through disciplined entrepreneurship is to teach you some ways to manage these complexities and be able to be strategic in the way you build things in your startup. So one anecdote that I like to tell people about when it comes to disciplined entrepreneurship is back during the bootcamp that I attended, my team and I, it was the 3rd day of bootcamp, and every other bootcamp team already had a startup idea that they were working on at the time. But for us, we were still trying to figure out what problem did we want to solve, or like what was the market. So we felt like we were behind. In fact, we were behind. But even though it was tempting to just pick an idea and roll with it so that we can catch up to the others, we decided to resist that. And we tried to have the discipline in order to continue doing customer research until we really identified a problem that we could solve. So on day 4, our patience actually paid off, and we found a problem that was in this right sweet spot of a market problem that we can solve and a gap that we can be in. And we were very quickly able to catch up to the others in terms of creating a product. And we were one of the only teams at the bootcamp that did not need to pivot their initial startup idea. And so this is because that we were patient and we made some smart decisions. So the sort of takeaway from this is that in disciplined entrepreneurship, you are able to control your success to a large degree, even though there's lots of uncertainties in a startup. And because you're able to control it, it makes success in a startup repeatable. All right, I'm going to quickly check the chat in case someone can't see.
I think we're good. We're good
okay,
so
we're good?
far. So yeah.
Okay, sounds good. I'll just continue for now, and then there's a Q&A session at the end, so I'll mention I'll answer those at the end. Okay, so it's moving on then. Okay, so the second point here is to really embrace sales, and I think for many of us, especially if we are from a STEM or a technology background, sales is something that we see as secondary to product. And this is also due in part to the fact that in startup media and whenever we hear about incubators and accelerators that are trying to teach us how to be entrepreneurs, they always tell us to focus on the product. And it's definitely true that you need to have a great product, and that if you don't have a great product, then you're jeopardizing your business. But if you only have that great product and you're not able to sell it, then you don't really have a business in the end. You don't have a company. You just have a nice item that you invented or that you built. So that's why sales is very important as well. And before the bootcamp, I didn't realize this, but it was at the bootcamp where they started to sort of explain this process of developing a sales model that I realized how important it actually was. So when you go into your own bootcamp, try and be really open to learning sales and be as active as you can in getting sales strategies into your sort of skill set. So one big thing from the bootcamp that was relevant to sales was the idea of looking at so if you're taking the online courses, you may have covered this already, but the fact that there is a difference between your end user and your customer. So your user is the person who actually uses your product at the end, and your customer is the person who makes the purchasing decision for that user. Oftentimes they can be the same person, but not always as well. So in the same way that you would turn user needs into product specifications, you want to turn customer needs, like the purchaser needs, into a sales model. And so that's the sort of big idea of sales here. At the bootcamp, our team, so we were targeting farmers in Thailand to begin with, and we found out that, so initially we were just going to sell farming equipment to them and do it as a sort of brick and mortar way. But we found out from our customer research that actually these people don't like to buy because the startup capital is too much. They prefer to rent instead. So then we became a equipment rental business. And then we found out that they're actually quite digitized. So they all use phones to talk to each other, and they also like to use their phones to pay. So that allowed us also to change our sales model so that we had an online method for these people to pay for their equipment rentals. All right, now our third strategy here. So make sure that you try and learn to measure at the bootcamp. Now, you probably have heard this everywhere, not just in entrepreneurship, but probably, well, engineering as well as business as well. You want to quantify things in your company. And there's many reasons for this, and I'll get into those in a second. But at the bootcamp, try and get your hands dirty with numbers. You can see that there's this table here. It's a table that my team at the bootcamp came up with to project our yearly cash flow. So we have 3 years here, and I don't really expect anyone to actually read the table. But the bottom line is that this table looks really ugly. It still looks ugly to me. And if I were just going into the bootcamp and I never touched accounting before, I would not want to be looking at this table. But it's exactly the idea that if you learn how to get dirty with these sorts of numbers and be able to come up with tables like this, that will give you an advantage when it comes to beginning your own startup at the bootcamp and outside of bootcamp as well. So some of the reasons why you want to quantify. I broke these down into 3 main levels because I thought that it's almost, you can think of it almost like layers. So in the first layer, the reason you want to measure is so that you can do operations. So you might know the quote from Peter Drucker, what gets measured gets managed. So that's exactly that here. So if you can see, say, your cash flow, you can see what your income is, you can also see what costs you're incurring as a startup, then it'll tell you how you can change things within your company so that you can get a higher cash flow, or maybe you can decrease cost. And this also goes for things like user research, where, for example, you might want to do something with your product so that you can increase user satisfaction. I know 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a e-seminar about quantifying empathy, and that is really relevant to this slide over here. Now, at the second level, you might also have known from before that when you quantify things in your startup, you can use those to prove to other people, say investors or maybe potential partners, that your startup can be successful. So in our table down here, we were able to show that given our business model, our product offering, as well as our sales model, we have the potential to break even in the second year and essentially not go into that and then crash and burn as a startup. Now, of course, this model here, this table is very simplified, but to someone who is looking to invest in your company or to work with you, they want to be able to see that you're not going to fail. So by measuring, you are providing them objective proof that you can succeed. Now, the third level is something that came not so much from the bootcamp, but from my own experiences running my startup. And it's that when you measure, you're also measuring for yourself. And there are 2 reasons for that. So the first reason is that by measuring, you can break away any illusions you might have about your startup. I find that most people, including myself, we have a tendency to think that we're doing better than we actually are. And so when you actually measure things, then you can actually show to yourself objectively if you're doing well or not. So if you are confident that you're doing well and the numbers say so, then your confidence is backed up. But anything other than that, if the numbers don't show that you're actually doing well, then you probably have to work on something within your company. Now, the second part of this is that sometimes you're going to grow doubtful in your startup. And I think it's quite natural because you're working in something that's high stress, it's unexplored, and there's many uncertainties. So if you have good numbers, you can also use those as objective proof that you are doing well. And it's a sort of encouragement for you to continue doing what you were doing before. Okay, number 4 now. So this one's really straightforward, and it really is. Sometimes you have to know when to stop talking and stop thinking and just go out into the real world and test it. Quite often we think that in our minds, the world works a certain way. And many times, given our life experiences, that can be true. But because in the startup world, you're working in something that's very, very new, unexplored, it means that you can't necessarily rely on your prior experience to make a decision. So I remember many times during the bootcamp when my team and we would be debating a certain problem or a question. For example, what business model should we choose? But then we debate for, say, 20 minutes to half an hour, and we're at an impasse. We don't have any solution that comes out of it. And then you think more about it, and you realize that, actually all of the logic that we use to back up our points in this debate, they might not even be true because we don't actually know anything about the real world. So you have to, again, have the discipline to be aware, to identify when you're talking too much, when you're too much stuck in your own head, and when you have to go out into the real world and actually execute. So it could be that you need to do customer research, talk to some potential users. Maybe you have to build a very low fidelity prototype just to prove that something works or not. But either way, you can't just stay inside your mind. You have to go out sometime and actually do. Now, the follow-up to this is that you have to be aware of the assumptions that you're making in your startup. So quite often, for example, you might think that, well, this customer, the farmers in Thailand, if they are customers, well, they don't like to pay by phone. They're farmers, and I'm sure they're poor. But then when you actually talk to these farmers as your customers, you realize that they actually know, they're actually much more financially capable than you might expect. And so your business model changes. Your assumptions can be verified or it can be disproven. And that's the main idea from this point. Okay, so strategy number 5. This one was a little difficult to translate from a lesson into an actual bootcamp strategy, but I'll try my best. So the original lesson that I learned from bootcamp, so I was talking to one of the lecturers who were there, and then they mentioned that as a business, their company was trying to avoid investment from venture capital and instead try to become profitable. And you'll notice that this is a recurring theme throughout the boot camps. So they'll always ask you to try and be profitable or come up with a business model that can let you gain a profit over X amount of years. And it's really different from what you see in the media, which is all about investment. So in a startup, even though you will probably at some point need investment, eventually at the end game, you're going to have to become a profitable company if you want to build something that can last for years to come. So make sure that you're trying to build a startup that can be profitable rather than just investable. If you have profit, then you're financially self-sufficient and it makes you more attractive to investors, funnily enough. But if you only have investment, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to break even someday. So we see from the picture here, it's taken from a lecture slide at the bootcamp. So it's a graph that shows how the cash flow of a startup changes over time. So in the early years, there's a lot of these zigzags, and they refer to sort of the investments, the cash infusions that the startup gets. And you see that it's very erratic, and so that startup is highly dependent on their funders. But then once the startup gains its profitability, then it's able to control its own growth more. And you see an almost hockey stick growth there where they have a recurring revenue stream that they can use to support their startup. So if we're going to apply this more directly to you going into the bootcamp, so once again, you want to be building something for the long term. And if you're thinking long term, then it also means that at the bootcamp, you want to make sure that you're not just building your venture there for the pitch competition that takes place at the end of it. You want to be building a great business that has a good pitch, but it doesn't necessarily need to win it. But the bottom line is that this business should have a high promise of becoming successful after the bootcamp. Remember that the bootcamp is only 1 week, and so it is difficult to build something that is a great business right from the outset. So I took this a bit from Guy Kawasaki, but basically he said, don't build for a great pitch, build for a great business. So similar for you, when you walk out of the bootcamp, make sure that you didn't only learn how to make a great pitch. Make sure that you know how to build a great business that can last for the long term. Okay, so I think I'm going a little fast here, but I think we'll be okay. So slide number 6 now. You want to be learning strategically at the bootcamp. And the best way I think to preface this is to say, at the bootcamp, don't forget how much you paid to be there. And I know all of us had to pay a lot to come to this bootcamp. It is a valuable experience. But again, the price tag is kind of hefty. And so make sure that you are maximizing what you're getting out of this bootcamp. Make sure that every minute, every second of your time there, you're trying to learn something that you can take out of it and use it to improve your own knowledge or your own abilities. So at bootcamp, they do something really nice, which is cram some of the world's best innovators, the best experts into a single room. And you can, in that room, talk to anyone you want and learn from them. I think that's one of the best things about it. So the way the analogy I like to use is that the bootcamp is a knowledge buffet, and it's up to you to eat as much as you can before that buffet closes. So make sure that you really take advantage of your time there. One really big thing that you should do is to ask people around you for advice, as well as to ask them about their experiences. So some people there, they may be CEOs, they may be professors, maybe they're managers, or maybe they're even entrepreneurs who haven't graduated yet. Maybe they dropped out. Because you have such a diverse range of experiences, as well as people from all over the world, you really just need to tap into that in order to get something out of it. So try and ask questions to people, and don't be afraid to get into a discussion. And one last thing is that you should try and be resourceful. So don't just ask people about a question that you might have during the bootcamp. For example, okay, what business model should we do? Try and ask people questions that can also help you outside of bootcamp. Maybe you have something that you're already working on, and you want mentorship or guidance from the people at the bootcamp. And because there's so many experts at the bootcamp, you can probably find at least one or two people who are able to help you, or may have the connections that they can connect you to increase your network and to help you find other people. Okay, and strategy number 7. So you want to be innovating very intelligently at the bootcamp. And what I mean by this, so it's a interesting thing that I've noticed, and it's that in the mainstream media, we often notice that what we see as innovation in the media and in the news are things like AI, blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and whatever Elon Musk comes up with. And they're definitely innovations, don't get me wrong, but then you want to make sure that you don't feel pressured as an entrepreneur to necessarily come up with a startup that uses those technologies or uses those innovations. Quite often, you'll find that for example, if you actually go look at the investment portfolios of some of the biggest venture capital firms from around the world, you'll notice that many of them are they actually don't have anything to do with AI or some of these trendy technologies. What they're doing on the flip side is they're solving a problem that actually exists. When you're only doing things from the mainstream, you tend to innovate in a top-down manner, where you're trying to apply a technology or something simply trendy to a solution. And that's a band-aid thing that won't necessarily work out. You want to be flipping it around and doing it bottom up. So try and innovate from first principles. Look at the way the world is currently working. Look at the way that the status quo is structured. Look for gaps in that and see if you can find a way to solve some of these gaps, or if these gaps can be solved at all. One thing to remember in this process is that when you're innovating, it's quite an unobvious process. If innovation were easy, then a lot more people would be beginning startups and inventing things. But it's not easy. And so when you feel challenged because at the bootcamp you can't figure out what problem to solve, or you don't know what solution to pursue, that's okay. It just means that you need to put in more work in terms of research as well as iteration, so that you can eventually get to that sweet spot of innovation, of something that's novel, but also very helpful for people who have problems that they want you to solve. I remember one company at the bootcamp it was called Manus Bio, and what they do is they manufacture chemicals fragrance chemicals for perfume companies. So you can think that just as same way we have lab-grown meats, they have lab-grown fragrances for perfume companies. When you first hear this, you probably will think that they sound very unexciting, almost even boring. And I thought so too. But it wasn't until they explained what market needs they had and their business model that I realized that what they are doing is actually quite disruptive. They have a lot of potential to change the way that the industry is approaching sustainability, as well as the way they source their materials. So you don't have to be trendy in order to do something that's very innovative. And last thing for this slide is that as an example of how to innovate from first principles, this is a picture of what one of the other teams did during their bootcamp. And so they were doing this definitely from first principles. So our bootcamp, once again, was about food. So what this team did is they mapped out the whole process of how to get food from the farm onto your plate. And you can see on the sticky notes there that they come up with possible gaps that they see in possible gaps or challenges that currently exist in this process that food takes to get to your plate. And then based on those processes, then they move forward and brainstorm solutions that they can solve. So they didn't start off by saying, we want to be machine learning for farms, but they said, okay, here are the problems that we see in the world, and let's see which one we can solve. So if I were to package all of these different strategies into a single term, I would say that, again, as I said in the first slide, that what the MIT Bootcamp is going to teach you is strategic entrepreneurship. And quite often when we're just starting off as entrepreneurs, maybe even for the second venture that we begin, starting a company seems like an extremely difficult task. It seems almost monolithic in nature. But what the MIT Bootcamps will try and teach you is that this process of starting a new business does not have to be an insurmountable task. It's something that can be broken down into a long chain of very manageable actions and decisions that you can take. And because of that, you can manage complexity and become someone who is capable of running a successful startup. I know that from my own experiences running my startup, when I first began with my co-founder, well, we were very daunted by the amount that we had to learn. We were very daunted by how much we didn't know. And after the bootcamp, one of the valuable things that we learned is some of the nuances of how we approach customers to ask them what are their needs, as well as trying to approach them for a partnership or a potential pilot project. So this bootcamp really is going to be valuable for all of you, and I really hope you enjoy it. Now, a very last set of comments I want to say. They're not really to do with the lessons from the blog post, but I think they're important as well. So this bootcamp it has limited time. And so over the course of it, you want to be making sure that you're spending your time effectively and you're getting as much as you can out of it. Before the bootcamp, I highly recommend that you set goals for what you want to do during the bootcamp. So for example, maybe you want to learn how to become a better CEO in your own company. You want to find a mentor at the bootcamp who can help you when you leave. Or maybe you're a product manager at a company right now and you want to find out how can you design better products and how can you sell them so that you can help your company's bottom line. So there's all these different possible things that you want to do, so that you want to make sure you know what these things are, so that when you're in the thick of the bootcamp, and trust me, it's going to be intense, you still have an overarching goal that you're working towards at the bootcamp that you can achieve. Now, I also want to say that you should immerse yourself in this bootcamp. It's not just a lecture series. So I'm currently in college, and I know that when class is off or when I'm on a lunch break, I'm not in that learning mode anymore, or I'm no longer actively learning. And I know that applies to many other people as well. So I want to say that when you're at the bootcamp, make sure that you're not off when you are on break. Your break times should be used as times where you can go out and meet other people and find potential contacts for your network or potential mentors who can give you advice on the things that you want to achieve in life. So always be on and really immerse yourself in the process. I'm going to end off this lecture part or the seminar part now so that we can go into Q&A. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you have a great bootcamp. It's really fun. Okay, so now for a sort of question and answers period. So this only took half an hour, this seminar part, so we can definitely talk more if you have lots of questions. Yeah, so feel free to shoot your questions at me.
I have questions.
Okay,
So, Arthur,
all right.
you seem very well put together. Thank you for this wonderful seminar.
Thank you for having me.
Did you plan your experience, your bootcamp experience going in, and what did you do?
Did I plan my bootcamp experience going in? I will say, yeah, for sure I did. And the big things that I wanted to take away from the bootcamp, the first one was, how do I actually build a better startup? So as I mentioned before, I had a startup at the time, and we wanted to find out how we can actually break into the market, because it was quite difficult for us to actually do that. And so we wanted to have advice from someone, experts who might have been through a similar situation before and can advise us on our next steps. The other big thing is being able to come out of this bootcamp as someone who understands the startup process better. So I think it's definitely true that you have to, the best way to learn how to become an entrepreneur is to actually begin a startup. And the MIT Bootcamp, it's only a week long, and it might seem like, okay, well, you can't actually begin a whole startup in just a week. But the things that you will learn from the bootcamp can really make you almost more experienced in a certain way. It's a practical training experience. And so going into it, I wanted to make sure that I became an entrepreneur who could have more rigorous skills and have a better understanding of how to make the right decisions.
Great, thank you for that. So you also spoke about, how you translated customer needs into sales strategy. Can you give a practical example of how you accomplished that during the bootcamp with the team?
Yeah, for sure. So actually, I'll think about that for a second. Yeah, okay. So essentially what we did is, so I'll talk about what the idea that we had at the bootcamp. And it's essentially a Uber platform for farmers in developing countries. In many of these developing countries, such as Thailand, Thailand's not truly a developing country, but in many places of the world, farming is one of the least technologically advanced industries, even though these industries are incredibly huge in these countries and have a big impact on the world agricultural trade. So what we wanted to do is to introduce modern technology into these industries, but taking away the monetary cost or taking away the monetary burden of doing so for farmers, and translating customer needs into a sales strategy. So it came down to us talking to Thai farmers and learning from them, not only like, what sort of product do you want? Do you want a nice shiny tractor? Do you want to be able to plant better rice? Or instead of asking only questions about the sort of products that they want and the everyday problems that they have, we also asked them about the way that they approached buying things, or the way that the sort of perspective that they had on new farming technologies. And by going that route, we were also able to understand what sort of product and how would we have to sell the product in order to have these customers adopt it. What would they actually like to have? And so I think it's a little difficult to explain, but that's how we got from just user needs and product specifications to that plus the customer needs and a sales model. Yes.
So moving on, it's kind of interesting because people ask this question a lot of times. And I'm going to reference back your example. So the product or service you're building was for people in Thailand in the rice fields.
Uh-huh.
You were in Taiwan. How did you get
Yes.
to the people in Thailand?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. And it ties into that first point where I mentioned how we were patient enough to keep doing customer research. So when we began, we wanted to do a startup that could help farmers in Taiwan become more resilient to natural disasters. So hurricanes happen every year in Taiwan, multiple times, and every time they come, they mow down the fields and then, or they break down the greenhouses. So the farmers always have to repair these greenhouses. And the trouble that we ran into is that no matter who we talked to, we got the same conclusion that the farmers, even though they would prefer not to have a hurricane come over and break their assets, they also aren't willing, or they aren't willing enough to invest in better technologies or better greenhouses or better crops that can allow them to withstand a hurricane. To them, they don't think that it's something that they would want to do, and it's too complicated for them to implement. So we realized, so that's how we got to day 3 without an actual problem to solve. And it was almost serendipitous because one of our teammates, she was from Thailand, and she had a lot of connections in Thailand, especially with the agricultural sector. So at the same time as we were doing this customer research in Taiwan, we were also sending surveys into to her connections in Thailand, where we were asking, okay, what kind of problems, do you have any problems as farmers in Thailand? What do you want to see solved? And we found out that there were many problems with farming in Thailand, and actually they're the world's second largest exporter of rice. And that makes them not only a place where you can help people's lives, but you can also create a financially viable company. So that was quite intriguing to us. So we dove more into that, and we found out that every year, about 2 or 3 times, there's a huge torrential rain that will flood all the fields. Similar in Taiwan, it destroys their crops. And these people wanted a way to either prevent this, or they wanted to be able to recover quicker. And so our startup, we decided to focus on the recovery part. So we were doing modern farming equipment rentals, and we essentially we were trying to come up with a way where people could use our product in order to reduce the recovery time from a few weeks to just a couple days. And so, yeah, that's the big adventure that we took to get from Taiwan to Thailand.
And I'm gonna get into some of the questions now. Drayton was asking, you know, this is really a full-on question specific to market analysis regarding potential customers. How do you get access to them? Do you call friends and family? In your case, it sounds like your teammate had a resource, or was a resource to get into a different country. What else did you guys do for that?
Yeah, so in regards to what we did in the other country, so we sent surveys out. That really helped. But I think what helped us the most was the actual cold calls that we did. So we cold called some of the people in Thailand. We even talked to someone who was one of the Thai King's advisors for agriculture. And so she gave a lot of useful input for us. And the idea of doing a cold call is so that you can understand, you can ask more questions, you can ask them more quickly, and you can actually build a relationship with someone who can give you info. So if you think of it like espionage, you're kind of coming up with a source in a different country. Now, back to I think the original question, which was, what are some ways that you can source possible customers that you can talk to? I think that's actually a really difficult question. And it's something that in my own startup, we had a lot of difficulty in trying to solve, because there's so many people you could talk to. Everyone is busy. So how do you actually reach out to them? The first part, it really has to do with who your customer is. And it sort of goes back to that point where you have to understand what your customer's needs are. Who is the person who is going to be actually buying or using your product? So for us, for Thai farmers, we had to make sure that we called before the flood was going to begin, because during the flood, they weren't going to be on the phone because they were taking care of their farms and their families. So that's one way that you can figure out what would be the best time or who would be the best people to contact. I think if you're going to go for a consumer product, that's probably the most straightforward. You think about what are you actually trying to solve, or what product are you going to make, who is it for, and then you go to those people and talk to them. I think the best way is always to get as much face-to-face as you can with them, or if you can't, at least video call. And it really is because with a survey, you can't always predict what sort of will the person that you sent the survey to actually have anything productive to contribute to this survey. You can't really figure that out beforehand. So if you can go face-to-face or talk to them directly, you're going to learn a lot more than only doing a survey. Yeah, that would be my strategy for it.
Regarding the surveys, can you share a little bit more about the questions that you asked in the surveys? Because, you know, oftentimes we don't know if we're asking the right questions, and how do you determine if those questions that you were asking were appropriate questions so that they were not too leading or that it was going to bring you down a specific path?
Yeah, for sure. That is actually quite difficult. So I think, okay, so probably the easiest way to make sure that you don't have a leading question, or that your questions are broad enough but not too broad either, is to have multiple people check over the questions that you're sending out. So not only check it out yourself and with other people, maybe also get some of the bootcamp mentors, or if you're not doing it at bootcamp anymore, get a mentor from outside to take a look at your questions and help you to determine whether these are leading or not. I think another great way is to actually, instead of just treating these questions as a survey, try asking them in an actual interview. So just have one interview with someone where you can ask these questions, and then you can see, depending on what they answer, if you're kind of leading them on in a certain direction. And then based on that, you can iterate on the questions that you send out, and then send another version that you can send to more people.
I'm gonna step one step back a little bit. Drayton asked another question. How many ideas did each team start off with on average? Of course, you can speak to your team. And how did you narrow that down to one? Of course, you know, at the bootcamp, we start at problems that then develop into opportunities. And so maybe you can share, how did you distill that?
Yeah, so essentially, how did we filter our ideas like that? Okay, good question. I don't know too much about other teams because we were too busy on our own. We were too busy at our own whiteboard. But I think an interesting trend to see is that every team started off with what they are passionate about themselves as people. So some teams really wanted to bring sustainability into the supply chain. They wanted to make the supply chain transparent. So all of their ideas, maybe they come up with 5 at a time, revolved around that. So, and for our own team, we said, okay, we want to help farmers. We want to help farmers who don't have access to the best technology right now have access to better technology. And so when we initially came up with our idea, actually, I'll backtrack a little. What our team did was we specifically tried to avoid coming up with ideas, because every time we came up with an idea, we sort of got lost in it. We led ourselves on, essentially. We would start thinking about all the cool reasons why this idea could be the best ever. But until you actually validate them, they won't actually necessarily be of any use. So what we instead tried to do is we came up with problems that we could possibly solve. So when we were first working on the problem in Taiwan, I believe we started with around one or two problems or questions that we wanted to understand. So it was, the hurricanes are destroying crops in Taiwan, and we want to help farmers. And then I forget what the other problem was actually. And then from this initial space of problems, you move on as you learn more through customer research and prototyping, and you better define what you're looking for. So by the time we got to thinking about Thailand, we had three big problems on the table. And it was, well, one of them was, how do we modernize farming technology in Thailand? And when we decided that that one was the most promising problem to pursue, then we were able to come up with even more problems to solve now. So what kind of equipment do we want to help people with? What is the general perception of technology for farmers in Thailand? Things like that. So I would actually say, don't think in terms of ideas when you're coming up with a venture at the bootcamp, but try and generate as many problems as you can, narrow them down on, say, a whiteboard or with sticky notes into a subset that you can find out more information about. And every step of the way, you don't come up with ideas, but you keep narrowing down the problem until you finally have, say, one problem that you know very confidently can be solved and is a sweet spot for solving. And that's when you start to come up with ideas for it. I think if you start with ideas too early, then you risk doing the sort of top-down design I mentioned earlier. You start doing things not necessarily because they're needed or because they'll turn into a great business, but you do things that you think would be cool. But then again, your thoughts aren't always an accurate reflection of the world. Yeah. Hope that answers your question.
Amazing answer. I'm going to shift gears a little bit to Christian's question. He says, Arthur, do you think you had a successful team at the bootcamp, and if so, why?
Sorry, if I had a successful team?
Yes. Do you think, so Christian's question was, do you think you had a successful team at the bootcamp? And if so, why?
Yeah, I would definitely say I had a successful team, and for many reasons, of course. The biggest one I can think of right off the bat was the sense of community that we got from it. It was interesting because on our team, we had one person who just graduated, one person still in school, that was me, and we also had people who were very experienced. One person had, I think, 3 PhDs, someone was nearing retirement and was helping this supranational organization do some sort of consulting. And then we also had an AI engineer who was also a product manager. So there was this huge range of skills and experiences, but we were still able to really come together and not only learn from each other and build something cool and meaningful, but also have fun. I remember a lot of times where it's getting challenging at bootcamp, but we're still able to really laugh it off. And that's really valuable. On the more practical side, I guess, I would say my team was successful also because we came up with a business that we thought we could actually take out of the bootcamp and continue with it. So we actually tried it, and then everyone got too busy and it didn't work out at the end. But we built something that I think for the pitch competition at the end wasn't necessarily going to be that attractive to the judges, but it was something that we proved through our customer research and through our initial financial forecasts that it was something that could be promising. And if we actually wanted to pursue it as a team and quit whatever we had at the time, then we could actually do it. Yeah, so I would say for that reason, we were successful as well.
Coming back to a follow-up question that to this question about your team, you mentioned that you had debates with the team. Debates are a really good word for arguments.
Yeah, they were arguments. Yeah,
yes,
it's just a euphemism.
So, how did you fight fair, and how did your team members fight fair and fight well in your team?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. I think what you have to realize in terms of fighting fairly is that everyone has their own opinion on what's best, and they really want to make this thing a success. It's not just because you think their idea is not going to work does not mean that they aren't trying their best to make your startup a success. So that's an important realization. And I think something important to do, which our team thankfully did, is that on the very first day when we actually came out with our team, we created a sort of team constitution where we specifically said when we find ourselves arguing, we have to make sure to only use objectivity and logic. If we find ourselves in that situation, then we all have to make sure that we can step back from it and be more constructive in a way we're trying to solve our argument. So I remember sometimes what would happen is that the very STEM-focused people would say one thing, and then the more business-focused people say another thing, and then we clash. And sometimes you have to be willing to be the person to say, okay, hold on, let's all cool down for a bit, and let's think rationally about this problem. Clearly, if we keep arguing, we won't be able to convince each other. So we might as well stop arguing and then turn this into something more productive, which is to turn it into a test or a hypothesis that you can go out and actually find out the answer to. So if you want to know, for example, what payment system you should use, okay, that's too specific. If you want to know, if you want to understand what sort of product specifications you need, for example, instead of arguing with your teammates about what's best, turn it into an experiment that you can all focus on, and that you agree that no matter what the result is, if we run a good experiment, all of us will we will all take the result, even if it's not what we originally wanted. So I think having this sort of system is important for arbitrating the arguments that you will inevitably have at your bootcamp.
Follow-up question to this. Connie's asking, you mentioned looking for mentors or advisors while you're busy working during the week. Did the coaches play a role in terms of helping manage your team conflict? Was there something that they shared that helped you in this process?
I have to think about that. I think one way that they really helped us in mediating our conflicts is sometimes instead of saying, let's turn this argument into an experiment, we just say, let's ask Andrew, or let's ask this person who is probably more knowledgeable about it than we are. And what this does is that you sort of defer a decision or an opinion to a subject matter expert who you all trust in. And so it makes things a bit more objective, and you can probably learn something from it yourself. So I think that's the main way that the bootcamp mentors helped us. I know for sure that if you really have a conflict that you can't resolve between yourselves, if you want to ask a mentor to help you out in mediating it, I'm sure they'd be willing to as well. Or they'll offer you tips at least. Yeah.
And also to say, just because you assign one one coach, we call them coaches now, just because your team is assigning a particular coach, it doesn't mean that you can't approach anybody else. Free to approach everybody, especially if they have an area of expertise that you need for your project. So Aditya is asking, Arthur, you mentioned at the beginning you already had a startup prior to attending the bootcamp. Did you think about, bringing your idea into the bootcamp, and did you even try? What happened?
Yeah, so the big thing for the bootcamp, I don't know if this was actually the rule that the bootcamp coaches and organizers made, but what I wanted to do coming into this bootcamp is to learn something new. And if you're going to bring your previous startup idea into the bootcamp, it's going to be hard to learn new things when you already have preconceptions from what you did before. And if you're going to be working with new teammates, well, it wouldn't really work out. You already have a team that you built outside of bootcamp. And if you're going to try and add on new people who are only staying for a week, then it's probably not going to be the best for your own startup in terms of what you accomplish. And for those people, they might not be necessarily that happy because they didn't get to work on an idea that they came up with themselves as well. So those are the two big reasons why I didn't take it into the bootcamp. And I think the other reason is more practical, and it's that my startup did not have to do with agriculture and food specifically. So to bring that into the bootcamp and try and implement it wouldn't really make sense in that respect.
Jumping a little bit here, you also talked about the peer pressure and about startup trends, about whatever's hot. I guess moving on since the bootcamp, how do you deal as an innovator entrepreneur? How do you deal continually over time with this peer pressure, if you can call it that, of the trends in a particular direction? You're running your startup. Well, what do you do? Any advice?
Yeah, great question. Okay, the one thing I can think of right now is, ideally what you could do is you could say, well, I'm going to ignore all the peer pressure and I'm only going to look at what's important and what needs to be solved in the world. But of course, in a real life setting, it's really hard to actually do that. I think one thing that helped was to actually look at the people who have succeeded in a very major way. So the peer pressure that you usually get are going to be from other people your own age who are just starting their own businesses, or you're going to hear from people who maybe they just made it big. They got a lot of funding from a well-known investor. And even though these people are definitely successful, a good way to break away from peer pressure is to look at the people who did not just have early success, but are actually building mature companies. So if you think about companies like, you could even look at, you could look at, say, Google or Yahoo, Airbnb, and they're mature companies now. And if you dive into how they first started, and then you try and learn from them, then it will help to almost calm you in a bit. Because when they were starting out, they didn't necessarily do what was most trendy, or what was, they thought it was going to be a unicorn or anything. You'll often find that they started their startups simply because this was something that they wanted to see in the world, and then they could make a business out of it, so they did it. And I think an even more interesting example is to dive even deeper than just the tech giants that came out in recent years, and to actually look at some of the companies that have been around for hundreds of years. Okay, most of the ones I'll mention are only around for, say, 100 years. So think about things like Mitsubishi, or General Electric, Ford, or Samsung. Some of these companies, they seem like just household names now, and they seem almost boring in that sense, because they're not tech startups, they're not trendy or anything. But if you think about when their founders first began, these huge companies used to be startups as well. And try and learn from what these people, these founders were doing at the time, their own perspectives on things, and then use that to understand how you should approach your own startup journey as well. So rather than succumbing to peer pressure, look instead at the footsteps of people who have not only made it big, but created a big change in the world and have sustained that change for decades.
One final question, Arthur. You came to the bootcamp, and after a week, the bootcamp was over. What was going back to life as you knew it? Was it going back to life as you knew it, or was it all completely different? And how did you make sense of the experience and reintegrate it to your life?
Reintegrate into society. Yeah, it's kind of like that. I remember, so the funniest thing that happened was that when I got back to school after bootcamp, everyone I saw looked like someone from the bootcamp for some reason. It was almost like I'd seen these people for so long that someone turns the corner, I'm like, oh, wait, no, it's not that person actually. So that was the most interesting or most unique part. As for the experience coming back, I'll be honest, I know that everyone says that the bootcamp is very life-altering. And when it first came back, I definitely knew it was a very good experience and I gained a lot from it. But I didn't see the actual changes in my life just yet. But it wasn't until maybe a few weeks or a few months after the bootcamp that I realized that now in my startup or in my own career choices, the way I'm making decisions has very much been influenced by what I learned at the bootcamp. Especially a lot of these lessons or the lessons I wrote about in my blog post, or the strategies I presented today, I didn't think of them until maybe 2 or 3 months ago. So there's a lot of reflection that comes after bootcamp, and you'll have learned so much that only once you actually sit down and think about what you learned and crystallize those into big takeaways, can you really realize how much your life has changed since then.
Arthur, thank you so much for your time today.
No, not at all. Thank you everyone for listening. Happy that I was able to do this.
For everybody who's tuning in, we will see you at the Bootcamp, and we can't wait to see you, and bye for now.
Have a great bootcamp. Bye.